I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Boonwurrung people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
You know that when you're sitting down, you taste those wines, that's when you realise that all that extra effort was worth it. And unless you're going to sort of push yourself to discover new heights, and I certainly don't have any interest in a job where you sort of clock on and clock off and don't challenge yourself.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Simon Black is Chief Winemaker at Montalto Estate in the stunning Mornington Peninsula. He heads up an award-winning winemaking team at the 5-star winery and joins us today to talk about life at the edge of Victoria. Hi, Simon. Thanks for joining me.
Shanteh, thanks for having me.
Oh, such a pleasure to have you, and I've been such a big fan of Montalto Estate for some time. Now, I noticed on Instagram that you call yourself a grape interventionist. What is that exactly?
I think for quite a while there are a lot of winemakers sort of talking about low intervention winemaking. And for me, low intervention doesn't necessarily mean the wine's going to be better. I think it's about being considered. And as a winemaker, it's your job to intervene when you think you need to get what you think is going to be the best expression of your wine. So intervention when it's required, pretty much.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I mean, if we didn't intervene at all, you'd just have raisins on the ground, wouldn't you?
That's right. And they'd eventually turn to vinegar. So, intervening is the most important part of winemaking, knowing when and how, that's key. And that way you can control the outcomes and get the best result.
Yeah, I like that idea. And you're right. It's all about timing and knowing what to do when, and that changes all the time, right? It's not a formula that you can just kind of replicate and follow year after year.
No, look, the variables each season are just incredible. So, weather, disease conditions, vine age. Every year the vine gets a bit older. And with climate change happening now, we're all sort of learning to deal with that. And it's a tricky thing to do. Knowing how and when to sort of manage these new conditions is really important. So it's tricky, but showing a level of flexibility and understanding your vineyards and understanding your styles, and again, coming back to the intervention, knowing how to intervene in the best way to either maintain style and maximise quality, or if you need to change the style a bit, knowing which direction you want to take on that path as well.
Yeah. I totally get that. Do you remember, let's go back a little while, and do you remember a first memory of wine where you kind of first took notice of wine? And tell me how you kind of found your way into being a winemaker at one of the most incredible estates in Australia.
My father was a keen wine drinker, to the point where he actually he had restaurants for a while. He was in politics for quite some time and used to have a lot of long lunches. And I think by default he would enjoy wine that went with it. And then this was in Canberra in the 70s, and he discovered that the food scene in Canberra in the 70s wasn't that great. So he left his job as a politician and he opened a restaurant. And so from an early age, I was always immersed in food, and I always saw Dad drinking wine, and I guess that was an era where it was reasonably normal for a parent to encourage your kid to enjoy the pleasures of life. So he would often let us smell his glass of wine, or he'd give us a tiny drop of wine in a glass of water and sort of make us think and appreciate it. And I guess it just grew from there. So I sort of grew up in kitchens, learning how to peel potatoes and carrots, and then as I got a bit older, I was given more responsibility, to the point where I used to sort of make starters, entrees, that sort of thing, on Friday and Saturday nights. And then as I sort of got into my teenage years, that wine element really sort of became part of the food element. So just that immersion and being around food and wine all my life has sort of led to where I am now, really.
So do you know your way around a kitchen? I mean, do you do a little bit of cooking these days?
Oh, look, I probably did a lot more when I was before I had kids, and my responsibilities as a a working sort of parent sort of overrode a lot of the cooking that I previously would have done. So my wife's become the main chef in the house, and she's great at what she does. So look, probably not as much as I used to, but I certainly still do have a real keen enjoyment. Dad showed me all the classic methods for cooking. He was heavily influenced by French cuisine. So, just learning how to make a roux and, different brown sauces and, making stock from start to finish and all those sort of basic sort of fundamentals in cooking. And I guess I've always been very keen and interested in, the way flavours and textures and acids and sugars sort of interact with one another. So I think when I look at food, I see very similar sort of qualities when it comes to winemaking. So I'm quite innovative and thoughtful about flavours and just trying to, I guess, get balance across all facets of either a meal or a wine I'm making.
I think it's a great vision, because I think being able to make a decent vinaigrette or of a blanc sauce or something like that, it is really all about balance, and it's not hard at all. But if you don't have an idea of the components that make up something that's greater than the sum of its parts, then you're in trouble as a winemaker. So, but I mean, you're incredibly busy, so I'll let you off the hook for not cooking as much. You graduated on oenology from Charles Sturt in 1996, and then you travelled around the world. Other than life experiences, how do you go about kind of choosing where to go and do vintage in that kind of formative years? And then where did you head off to?
Oh, look, I think it was more, I think when you're young, you kind of you're probably more desperate to find someone who wants you, really, because you don't have a lot of experience. So you kind of just make as many phone calls, or back then send a fax or a letter, as many as you can, and hope one will land with someone who has enough trust to give you a gig. So look, my probably one of my first big gigs when I travelled overseas, I had been travelling with my brother and another winemaker, and the other winemaker, who is Jim Chatto. We'd been doing a vintage together in the Hunter Valley, and we were about to go travelling together through Europe and America, and we'd been looking at opportunities for work just to sort of supplement the funding for the entire journey. And he discovered a flying winemaker group, and so we put our names up for that. I think he was sent to Romania, and I got thrust off into Moldova, which is now at the edge of all this Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So it was a pretty amazing experience. It was more of a life experience than a winemaking experience. Taught you how to deal with situations that were like far from ideal, and taught you a lot about communicating with people, and immersed me in a different culture and met some wonderful people in the process.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I mean, travel for anything like that is just so important, isn't it? And just, being away from everything and the people and having, like you said, to find ways to communicate and understand culture. But Moldova, that's pretty incredible. What are some of your favourite memories from that time?
Oh my goodness, it was such a shocking experience, to say the least, and the fact that the culture shock was remarkable, aside from the language, but just there's an entirely different way of thinking over there. So it was just more trying to adapt and fit into that. But look, some of the great memories are just some of the people I met. They're a country with very little, but what the people did have, they were always very open and willing to share. Their best bottle of wine, or what little they had, they shared it in its entirety. So it was a wonderful experience in terms of just witnessing humanity at its best, really.
Gosh, I would love to get out. I mean, obviously not right now, but some of those Eastern European countries just fascinate me. And what a wonderful experience. And I bet you won't forget it. Tell me about how you found your way down to Mornington Peninsula, of all places, and how you came about being head winemaker at Montalto in 2009. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I had a girlfriend at the time who had been who had a vintage job at Stonia. This is, I think, about 1995, and I'd been working in the Hunter, and then I'd gone down for a short stint at Campbell's in Rutherglen, and I had a weekend off and thought I'd come and visit my girlfriend. So I drove from Rutherglen down to the Mornington Peninsula and just went in and did a bit of volunteer work at Stonia Wines, where she was working. And so that was my first introduction to Mornington. And then on the back of that, I managed to get a vintage position at Stonia in 1996. And I just loved the area. And that position eventually ended, and I think I ended up going to the Yarra Valley and working for a winery there. At one point, I think it was towards the end of 97, Willow Creek Vineyard were looking for a winemaker to set up a new winemaking facility. And I was only, I think, 27 at the time, and I was just incredibly lucky to get offered the position. And I think, it was a pretty amazing and challenging position. I think what saved me, the lack of experience and knowledge. I was young enough to have an amazing amount of energy and passion and drive. So what I lacked in knowledge, I made up for in this just sheer bullishness and determination to succeed. And look, I was surrounded with some good people who were able to guide me and push me in the right direction when I got a little off course. So, but that was my first foray into the peninsula. And then I spent, I think it was about 5 years with Willow Creek, and then decided I wanted to do a bit more travelling. So I travelled around for a while, and then overseas, and then found my way back to Australia, where I set up another winery called Heathcote Estate, which is part of the
I think I've heard of that.
Yeah. So that was in 2002, and I was there for a while, and then I had a change of scenery, and I met my wife, and we eventually moved sort of further north up around the Alpine Valleys. Had some family up there, so we settled there for a bit, and then I was keen to actually get back to the Mornington Peninsula, and Montalto advertised for a winemaker, and they were also looking to build a new winemaking facility. So I threw my hat in the ring, and I was fortunate enough to get the position, and have been immersed here ever since.
Wow. Well, such a great coincidence. They were looking for someone, and that you happen to be the right person. You're coming into your, is it 12th vintage now, or are we further along than that?
I think I've just finished my 13th, yeah. So, a few years under the belt now.
So, I mean, Montalto is an incredible estate, and we can get a little bit further down into kind of how the tiers and the different vineyards are broken up. But when you first moved to Mornington Peninsula from Alpines and from Heathcote, what did you notice that was different? I mean, it's so beautiful. It's right on the coast there, lovely cool breezes. But talk to me a little bit about what you were thinking when you first moved down there and getting to know the region a bit more.
So from my first journey at Willow Creek, look, it was a pretty, end of 1997, it was a pretty young area in many respects. Viticulture was quite young. I mean, there had been some players around for, some time. So like the Stonia family had been around since, the early to mid 80s. I think Bailey Meyer with LG Park had sort of set his vineyard up sort of in the mid to late 70s. But other than that, there were not a great many people who had sort of established vineyards. I think Crittenden was another one, and maybe Merrick's Estate, George Kefford. But there were a whole heap of emerging wineries, like Willow Creek had finally set up a cellar door, and they opened a restaurant, and then there's been a whole succession of sort of businesses, sort of about 20 years old now, that have are now part of the big picture of the peninsula. So I guess there was probably an immaturity of experience and knowledge of viticulture, and we probably hadn't had the the decades behind us to really fully appreciate and understand what was required to make great wine. So, a lot of people have put Cabernet in, which, as time's gone by, we probably realise probably not the best variety suited to this area. And I think with time and experience, we now recognise that Chardonnay and Pinot are wonderful varieties that work really well here. So having sort of taken a 10-year break after leaving Willow Creek and before heading back to Montalto, when I did come back, I noticed a significant change where in viticulture, pruning techniques had changed. So at Willow Creek, we'd had things like hanging cane and silvo and these sorts of things, which are just, and there was a lot of focus on yield rather than quality. Not for everyone. Certainly some people had a different idea at the time, but certainly where I was working, that was a consideration. There was a lot of inputs into the vineyard, like, fertigation and fertilizing and things like that, which you could see probably wasn't required, but just out of a sort of dogmatic approach to how things are done and probably not having the knowledge, we were doing things more like on a farm sort of methodology for crop rather than quality. So when I returned, there had been a huge shift in thinking, a lot more focus on, the inputs and, what impact they were having and, how to improve outcomes. And certainly in terms of winemaking, I think, we'd had another sort of 10, 15 years experience behind us to actually apply our craft and work out what techniques worked and what techniques didn't. So I think having an innovative approach and being open to trying different things and working out what works and what doesn't work with your particular fruit has been really important. So probably the biggest thing is just a maturing of viticulture input, a maturing of vineyards too. We've got vineyards that are now 30, 40 years old. So our earliest vineyard was planted in 86. And I think you see a big difference in vines that have planted, young plantings compared to things that have 20, 30, 40 years of age on them.
Yeah, definitely. But, it's interesting for you to see that kind of growth over that time. And the reason I asked is because for me, I've always kind of thought of Mornington just, as a point of difference, it is just that little bit more isolated from the regions. You're a committee member for the Mornington Peninsula Vignerons Association. What's the importance of community because you are a little bit further away from some of the other regions?
Look, being immersed in a culture is really important. It kind of, it's a sharing of knowledge and experience and information and, being part of a collective, is much more powerful than sort of sitting out there on your own, I think. And I think, the Mornington Peninsula Vignerons Association have always been very communal, very welcoming, and it's really important. It's a really important aspect for all the growers on the peninsula. They, help to organise a lot of workshops for us. They channel a lot of information to us, a lot of research. They organise a lot of research projects, which the information is fed back to the growers and the winemakers to help digest and understand better what it is we do. They're really important in promoting the region, not only from a branding perspective, but also from a sales perspective and bringing new people to the area. So the area is it's boomed in the last 20 years. It's quite amazing. So, people really recognise it now. They view it as an amazing food and wine destination. And you can see just with the investments of the new Jackalope Hotel, Point Leo Estate. So a lot of money has come into the area and consumers are responding. It's a real holiday destination and, it's an incredibly beautiful place to be a part of. So there's no reason pretty much why you wouldn't come here, to be honest with you.
Well, totally agree with you. And I think you're right. There are so many great, incredible cellar doors and wonderful restaurants down there. But for me, in my experience, I actually saw the Mornington wines take off and that reputation kind of gather momentum before I remember there being these destination places to eat down there. And I think Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Pinot Gris had a lot to do with that. But I could be wrong. So what do you think where do you think, the reputation for fine wine, where did that start to really kind of take off? And was it those 3 varieties or was it something else?
Look, probably Chardonnay and Pinot, and then following with Gris and probably now Shiraz in the form of Syrah sort of styles. Look, I just think it's been a lot of commitment and hard work by a lot of small producers who have just been absolutely committed to quality. They've dedicated pretty much the better part of their working lives to explore and discover the potential of the peninsula. It's not something that just happens overnight. It's something that does take years and years. And you learn. You probably have a lot of mistakes on that journey, but the mistakes are as important as the successes, because without those mistakes, you don't learn. So I think it's all those guys who came before me and put in the hard yard to sort of help, I guess, light the path for the rest of us. And I think the new sort of generation that has come through have benefited from that, and everyone's as equally passionate and driven to improve. So the bar sort of gets lifted higher every year, and we're all pretty keen to step up to that mark and try and improve our own lot, really.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot to thank from those first pioneers and grateful for it. Mornington Peninsula wine isn't a hard sell in a restaurant. They tend to sell themselves. What always strikes me is that I think that in terms of stylistically, some of the varietals really have taken on their own identity down in Mornington. Talk us through, and one of those is often guests asking about why the Pinot is so deep in colour and got so much flavour. So talk us through the Mornington region and the moderating factors in the climate. I mean, you're right out in the peninsula with Port Phillip and Western Port Bay and the Bass Strait, and how does that influence the conditions of where the grapes are grown?
Look, probably the significant impact of being surrounded by water is that sort of moderating effect of temperature. So we don't suffer from springtime frost. So there's I guess a bit of an insurance policy there for us. But the other from the other side of it is that the moderating effect of water during those sort of hot summer days has a cooling effect on the land. So if you're thinking about a super hot day in Melbourne where it might be sitting, let's talk about extremes, it might be in the 40s in Melbourne. Those hot breezes are coming down from Central Australia, being driven down with a northerly weather pattern, and for them to get to the peninsula, it has to cross Western Port Bay, and it's almost like an evaporative cooler. As the hot air sort of hits that body of water, it picks up moisture and has this cooling effect. So by the time it hits the peninsula, you sort of back down into sort of low to mid 30s, and that's pretty significant because it means that our diurnal temperature throughout that growing ripening period is usually sitting between about 15 and at the extremes 35 degrees, and vines are metabolizing. Doing most of their metabolizing between those two temperatures. If you go below 15, there's not enough warmth or heat for the vine to function. And if you go above above sort of 34, 35 degrees, the plant will actually close itself down. So the stomata and the leaves will shut down to avoid transpiring all the available water off into the atmosphere. So what we find is that the metabolizing of the vine is such that you just have this constant gradual ripening of the fruit without this sort of switching on, switching off sort of pattern. And that just seems to lend itself to just amazing sort of ripening conditions and accumulation of flavors and colors and tannins. But we still have enough sort of coolness to keep good natural acidity in the grapes. So it's just, I don't know, just all the weather, that sort of moderating effect of temperature seems to create these beautiful conditions that grow wonderful fruit. I mean, geographically, Mornington's a really compact area, but it's incredibly diverse. So I think the highest point on the peninsula is Arthur's Seat. I think that sits sort of a notch over 305 metres. Mm-hmm. So the peninsula will have, I think, the highest vineyard maybe around 250 all the way down to sea level. So you get this big elevation change, and you can also have a lot of different aspects. So, a lot of growers have northeast, southwest aspects. And between those elevations, you get soil change as well. So the Red Hill Main Ridge areas, which we refer to as up the hill, typically have sort of red, mostly red, but with yellow sort of clays. And those clays, they're like volcanic clays, and they tend to have a lot of high water and nutrient status. Whereas if you move further down the hill, back towards Churong and Murdoch and Merricks, those areas, you start to come out of these clays and you're into more sort of free-draining grey and brown sandy loams. So even though you're only talking, 10 to 15 kilometres, you get this dramatic change in elevation and growing conditions. So despite the compactness of the area, it is really diverse. So usually, as a rule of thumb, you'll probably find that wines from Red Hill and Main Ridge typically have probably more perfume, and they're a bit more delicate and pretty in style, whereas the wines sort of down the hill further north tend to show maybe a little more sort of richness and more plushness. So depending on the style of wine you like, you can almost target a producer that you think a style that you like, and head. If you like something a bit more plush, you might head to those producers further north on the peninsula. If you like something a bit more aromatic and fresh and pretty, you might head further up the hill. So
there's just so much to play with, isn't there?
It is.
Bit of a dream.
It is. Look, we have 6 sites across 4 sub-regions on the peninsula. So we've got vineyards at Main Ridge, Red Hill, Merricks and Churong. And the main ridge vineyards is about 170 metres above sea level, and our Churong's sitting at about 30. Now, as the crow flies, they're only probably 12 kilometres apart. But as an example of the extreme difference of those 2 sites, the Pinot from both those sites we've actually harvested 4 weeks apart in some years. And that is purely and simply to do with the growing conditions and the elevation. So that you just get a feel for the coolness of those sites up the hill, which are a bit more exposed through elevation. And because the soils are wetter and there's more nutrient, the canopy is actually a bit larger. So ripening happens a bit later. Whereas the free draining nature of the vineyards down the hill, you almost need to be careful that that you have enough water to make sure that you don't stress the vines too much on some of those hot days. Extreme differences over such a small geographical area. And everyone's vineyard is slightly different, and I think that's the beauty of it. There are lots of different aspects and elevations, and that means that everyone has their own little piece of unique dirt. And so even though it's compact, you can still see a difference in styles, and then you throw winemaking into it, and it just adds a whole new layer of complexity to it.
Yeah, certainly never gets boring. And I think, throughout Mornington, there are so many different styles and so many different varieties and take on what each estate is doing, which does make it really exciting. Montalto is broken up into 3 tiers or kind of chapters. If someone was, say, about to, head over to the cellar door and they were just thinking, I just want to wrap my head around the 3 kind of Montalto, Single Vineyard and Pen and Hill, how would you kind of explain those offerings?
I think if we look at at Pen and Hill, that's kind of our entry-level wines, and we make those to be just bright, fresh, energetic, clean and lively and really approachable. So we typically using clones that might, in the Pinot, we're probably using more sort of D clones and aromatic clones, and clones that can just give real freshness and vibrancy early on. With the estate wines, we're typically choosing vineyards that are probably older, and clones that will actually give a bit more depth and structure and power and intensity. And then the single vineyard wines are kind of, they're just self-fulfilling. They're all about the uniqueness of site and just harnessing the expression of that site in the style that we think is probably going to coax out the best expression. I kind of use the analogy, I kind of look at the single vineyard wines as being like the principal soloist in an orchestra. Mm-hmm. And and the estate wines being more like the orchestra playing together. So it's hard to distinguish. Sometimes I would look at the estate ones and go, well, maybe there's more complexity and there's more layers because there are sum of many parts. So, but it's up to the individual to think, well, is it better to listen to a principal violinist in an orchestra and just really admire the purity and the beauty of that person applying their craft to the highest level? Or, if you take that violinist and then you put them with other, a cello and other instruments, and then they're all exceptional talent as individuals, but when you put them together, does that give greater depth? It's that harmony. So look, it's up to the eye of the beholder, I guess, to sort of choose their path. But it's just, for me, I really love distilling each of our single sites down because they are unique and they offer such different qualities, but I can't ever sit there and say I prefer one over the other. I love them for who they are and what they have to offer. As our main Ridge Pinot is always very fragrant and very delicate and pretty. But if you're being critical, you might say, it could use some more intensity or structure or concentration, but that would defeat the purpose of the beauty of that particular site. And those other qualities can be seen in our other vineyards. So just having a mix of different vineyards is just a real thrill because you can see them for what they are.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know the Pen and Hill Chardonnay and Pinot have been a couple of kind of house Chardonnay and Pinot in my house, and because they just offer so much flavour for the price point, I think. So they've definitely featured in my house more than once. But I know if I went to a restaurant, I'd probably choose to drink something like the Tourong Chardonnay, or perhaps even, So I think that there's really, depending on your mood and what you're in the mood, where you are, there's so many different layers to the portfolio in itself, which is lovely to have. Simon, when was the last time you kind of stopped yourself in your tracks in your job and thought, this is why I do this and I love my job, this is incredible?
Look, it actually happens pretty regularly. There are times like we did a tasting yesterday. We've just been putting our rosé blend together for 2022, and we're always thinking of different ways to do things. So this year we employed a winemaking technique called stabulation, which is where you very gently press the grapes, and it's about extracting flavour out of the lees, the grape lees, prior to fermentation. So you actually chill it down for an extended period of time, try and actually keep it from fermenting for sort of 2 to 3 weeks. And during that process, you're extracting a lot of flavour. And you get a big shift in texture. So we were just tasting the various blend options we had yesterday, and this particular method that we used for the first time was just a real highlight, and it sort of turned a few lights on for the winemaking team, and it was just very satisfying to see that all this extra effort we'd put in over vintage for this technique had really it just brought a lot of fruitful outcomes for us. So I guess that's an example. I mean, there's always times where you'll do things where they don't go to plan, and you're not disappointed, but sometimes you go into a trial thinking you're going to get a certain outcome, and it actually turns out to be the opposite. And I think even though it's disappointing in that regard, sometimes those different outcomes are actually more beneficial than you'd expected. It's amazing what a small amount of a trial wine in a form that you would consider not to be ideal in its individual component. It's amazing if you put a tiny percentage, 1 or 2 or 3% of that in a greater blend, how much of additional complexity and layers it can put through a wine. So whilst we might do some trials that don't work out as individual wines, they always find a place to add complexity. And it's almost like another tool in the toolkit. So you might find that in 2 years' time you'll be confronted with certain weather condition or something, or a certain event in the winery where you'll remember that technique from the previous year and find that maybe that's the year to pull that tool out and use it to overcome an obstacle. So look, it's just every day is just another part of the journey, and it's always a thrill just to be always thinking and trying to discover new ways to make wine and new flavors. And, I guess the other thing is that every vintage is different, and the challenge to try and continue to make great wine with all these variables in front of you, that's probably the hardest thing, but it also keeps it interesting. I think that's probably the main thing.
It's the quest, isn't it? That just keeps...
totally. The quest that feeds the fascination, as I kind of like to put it.
Absolutely. I love that. And I also can see that, being that you're at the head of a team there, that when you ask them to do a lot more work, like something like stabulation, it must be really rewarding when you're like, see, I told you all that work was worth it, and kind of wipe your brow and think, whew.
Look, sometimes we're sitting there in vintage when, the day has gone a lot longer than you'd planned and everyone's a bit tired. And it's probably getting through those times where you're sitting there going, I just really want to go home now. I'm pretty exhausted. But that when you're sitting down, like I mentioned yesterday, and you taste those wines, that's when you realise that all that extra effort was worth it. And unless you're going to sort of push yourself to discover new heights, and I certainly don't have any interest in a job where you sort of clock on and clock off and don't challenge yourself. So I think that the team are always fascinated by it, and as a collective, we bounce off one another and enjoy the challenge. Yeah, it just keeps it interesting, which is really important.
So nice to be able to have something tangible as well, like you said, to taste the kind of results of your work, vintage after vintage. Whereas, in a lot of other professions, you have to wait for someone to hand you an award or to tell you, you've done a great job. But wine is tangible, and you're able to kind of see the fruits of your labour, which is so lovely. Yeah, Simon, I want to know from you, if you could only drink 3 beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Oh dear, well, wine's going to be up there at the top, without a doubt. Do I have to choose a variety, or I can just loosely get away with wine as a genre?
Oh, if you make the other 2 more interesting, I'll let you get away with
look,
it.
I'm a bit of a sucker for gin.
Ew, okay, good.
So I think gin's a pretty important part. There's a lot of drinks you can make with gin, but and there's a lot of gins out there at the moment. So one of my other winemakers, Hannah, she is a bit of a gin fanatic.
Awesome. So
we enjoy gin every now and again. And look, I think probably coffee would be the other one I couldn't let go. It sustains us through the long hours of vintage, and we have a coffee machine that we all stand around a couple of times a day and just talk about what's happening, and it's kind of a little point of a meeting point where we can just enjoy each other's company and and just talk through what happened on the weekend and talk through what's going to happen during the week and for the rest of the day, that sort of thing. So probably those 3, yeah.
Yeah, definitely staples. And I don't know where we'd be without coffee. I don't know if a lot of wine would get made if we didn't have that. So
no, good to see it. Probably all a bit sleepy around the come about 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah, after that lunch, it's that flat line.
That's it, yeah.
Well, Simon, it's been fantastic to hear from you. I hope that we get to have another chat next time I'm down in the peninsula. And thank you so much for making some time. And we love what you do, and keep on keeping on. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in your 14th vintage.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram @overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.